The day my son laughed at me, there was a red notice taped crookedly to my front door. It was raining, not hard, just that steady, cold November rain that makes everything look abandoned even when people are standing right there watching. A sheriff's deputy stood on my porch with his hat pulled low, pretending not to see the neighbors peeking through curtains. My daughter-in-law, Melissa, sat inside a black SUV at the curb with the engine running. And my son, Daniel, stood in my driveway with his hands in the pockets of a wool coat I had bought him 10 Christmases earlier. He was smiling, not a nervous smile, not a sad one, a satisfied one. The kind of smile a man gives when he thinks the last piece has finally fallen into place. The deputy cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Whitaker, I'm sorry. You have 72 hours to vacate the property." I looked at the paper. Then I looked past him at the old maple tree in the yard, the one my wife had planted the year Daniel was born. Its leaves were almost gone. So was she. And now, according to that piece of paper, so was my house. Daniel took one step closer and said, just loud enough for the deputy to hear, "Dad, I told you this would happen if you kept being stubborn." I didn't answer. He leaned in. Rain gathered on his eyebrows. Then he whispered, "You lost, old man." And then he laughed, a quiet little laugh, like I was a joke he had been waiting years to tell. I still remember that sound more clearly than the thunder that followed. Because in that moment, standing on the porch of the house I had built with my own 2 hands, I realized my son didn't just want my property. He wanted to see me humiliated. He wanted me small. He wanted me afraid. But what Daniel didn't know was that I had spent 41 years as a structural engineer, county inspector, and later a forensic consultant for insurance fraud cases. I had spent my life studying cracks, in buildings, in stories, in people. And the notice taped to my door had one tiny crack in it, one mistake, one detail so small no one else noticed it. But I did. And because of that detail, my son was about to learn something he should have learned when he was a boy. Old men are not always weak. Sometimes we are just quiet, and quiet men tend to keep records. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I was 72 years old when my only son tried to steal my home. Before that day, I had lived on Willow Ridge Lane for 38 years. The house was not large by rich people's standards, but to me it was everything. A white 2-story home with green shutters, a long porch, and a workshop behind the garage where the smell of sawdust never really left the walls. I built that workshop before I built the nursery. My wife, Elena, used to tease me about that. She would stand in the doorway with her hands on her hips and say, "Tom, only you would build a room for tools before building a room for a baby." And I would say, "Tools don't cry at 3 in the morning." Then Daniel was born, and I learned tools were much easier to understand than children. Elena was patient in ways I never was. She had this gift of making a house feel warm even when the furnace was broken and the bank account was empty. She kept flowers on the kitchen table. She wrote notes and hid them in lunch boxes. She believed people could be better tomorrow than they were today, even Daniel, especially Daniel. When he was little, he followed me everywhere. He had blonde hair that never stayed combed and a laugh that filled the whole backyard. I taught him how to hold a hammer, how to read a tape measure, how to check if a shelf was level. He used to say, "Dad, when I grow up, I'm gonna build houses too." But Daniel didn't grow into the kind of man who built things. He grew into the kind of man who wanted things already built. And if he couldn't earn them, he found a way to make someone feel guilty for not handing them over. That was the first truth I spent too many years avoiding. If you've ever raised a child who slowly became a stranger, you know the pain I'm talking about. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in tiny disappointments. A lie about school, a missing 20 from your wallet, a girlfriend crying in your driveway, a call from a landlord, a job lost because the boss had it out for me. And each time you tell yourself it's just a phase. You tell yourself your child is still in there somewhere. You tell yourself love will be enough. Elena believed that until the end. I tried to. But men like me, men who measure foundations for a living, we know something. A crack ignored becomes a collapse. Daniel's cracks started early. By 30, he had been fired from 4 jobs and had blamed all 4 bosses. By 35, he had borrowed money from us 11 times and called it help, never debt. By 40, he had married Melissa. And that was when everything changed. Melissa was beautiful in the way a knife can be beautiful under bright light. Sharp, polished, cold. The first time she came to our home, she walked through each room slowly, not like a guest, but like an appraiser. She touched the granite countertop, looked at the crown molding, paused at the fireplace. Then she smiled at Elena and said, "This house must be worth a fortune now." Elena laughed gently. I did not. I noticed Daniel watching Melissa, waiting for her approval like a dog waiting for a signal. That was the first time I felt something inside me tight. At dinner, Melissa asked too many questions. How much land came with the property? Was the mortgage paid off? Had we considered downsizing? Did we have a trust? Alina answered politely. I watched. I watched the way Melissa's smile disappeared whenever the conversation moved away from money. I watched the way Daniel drank too much wine and called me old-fashioned 3 times. I watched Melissa glance at the framed wedding photo above the mantel, not with tenderness but calculation. That night after they left, Alina was washing dishes at the sink. I stood beside her, drying plates. I said, she was measuring the place. Alina didn't look at me. She just said, maybe she's nervous. I said, no, she's hungry. What? Alina sighed, Tom. I knew that tone. It meant I was being too hard. Maybe I was. Maybe I wanted to dislike Melissa because I already knew Daniel was weak around strong women. Maybe I wanted someone else to blame for what Daniel had become. But 3 months later, Daniel called asking for $25,000. He said it was for a business opportunity. Melissa called it an investment. I called it what it was, a mistake. Alina wanted to help. I refused. That was the first time Daniel stopped speaking to me for 6 months. The second time lasted almost a year. The third time ended only because Alina got sick. Cancer changes the temperature of a house. It makes every sound softer and every silence heavier. By the time Alina's diagnosis came, Daniel had already become the kind of son who visited when he wanted something and vanished when responsibility knocked. But Melissa came around more often. At first, I thought maybe I had misjudged her. She brought soup. She brought flowers. She sat beside Alina and rubbed lotion into her hands. She asked if we needed help sorting paperwork. That last part bothered me. One afternoon, I came into the bedroom and found Melissa sitting beside Alina with a folder open on her lap. Alina looked tired. Melissa looked alert. I said, "What are you doing?" Melissa closed the folder too quickly. "Oh, just helping Mom organize some old documents." Mom, she had never called Alina that before. Alina smiled weakly and said, "She's just being helpful, Tom." I looked at Melissa. Her eyes didn't move, and that's when I realized something. Some people do not wait for death with grief. They wait with patience. Alina passed away the following spring. The morning she died, rain tapped the bedroom window. I sat beside her, holding her hand, listening to her breathing become a sound I knew I would hear in my dreams for the rest of my life. Her last words were not dramatic. They were simple. Don't let loneliness make your decisions. At the time, I thought she meant remarrying. I was wrong. She meant Daniel. After the funeral, my house filled with people, casseroles, and whispered sympathy. Daniel stood beside me in a black suit and cried enough for everyone to see. Melissa managed the kitchen like she owned it. She told people where to put food. She answered the door. She accepted flowers. She even corrected my sister when she placed Alina's favorite vase on the wrong table. I was too tired to fight. Grief makes you careless. That was my first mistake. 3 weeks after the funeral, Daniel came to visit alone. That should have warned me. He never came alone anymore. He found me in the workshop, sanding the edge of a cedar box I had started making for Alina before she got too weak to climb the stairs. He stood there for a while, hands in pockets. Then he said, "Dad, we need to talk about your future." I kept sanding, "My future." "You're 71. I noticed. You're alone in a big house. It's too much." I looked up at him. There are moments when your child speaks to you and you hear someone else using his mouth. Melissa's phrases, Melissa's rhythm, Melissa's hunger. Daniel said, "Melissa and I were thinking maybe it makes sense for you to sell." I set the sandpaper down. "Were you?" He nodded. "The market is hot. You could get a great price, move into something easier. A condo, maybe assisted living down the road." Assisted living? Eventually, not now. I smiled, generous. He frowned. "Don't make it like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm trying to take something." I stared at him. He looked away first. That told me more than his words did. I said, "This house is not for sale." His jaw tightened. "Mom would have wanted you safe." That one hit me, because men like Daniel know where to cut. They don't swing wildly. They aim for the soft places. I said, "Do not use your mother's name to sell my home." He left angry. 2 days later, Melissa called. Her voice was sweet, too sweet. She said Daniel had been hurt by my tone. She said they were only worried. She said old men living alone sometimes make unsafe choices. Old men, not Dad, not Thomas, old men. That was when the early tension began, though I didn't call it that then. At first, it was small things. My mail arrived opened. Not all of it, just bank statements, insurance letters, county tax notices. When I asked Daniel, he said the post office was unreliable. Then my online banking password stopped working. The bank told me someone had attempted too many logins. Daniel said hackers target seniors. Then a woman from a senior living facility called and said she was following up on my family's inquiry. I told her there had been no inquiry. She paused, then said carefully, "Your daughter-in-law filled out the request." I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming. I remember looking at Alina's chair, empty. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt watched. A week later, I caught Melissa in my office. She said she was looking for old photo albums, but the file cabinet beside her was open, not the drawer with photos, the drawer with deeds, tax documents, insurance papers, and trust files. She gave me a smile. "I hope you don't mind." Daniel wanted a copy of his birth certificate. "What?" I said, "Birth certificates are in the blue folder." She looked down. The folder in her hand was red. I walked over and took it from her. Inside were copies of my property survey. She laughed softly. "Oh, wrong folder." But her fingers were shaking. That's when I realized something worse. Melissa wasn't just curious. She was searching for a weakness. After that, I changed the locks. Daniel called me paranoid. Melissa called me cruel. My neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, came over the next morning while I was sweeping the porch. He was 80, retired from the post office, and had the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years noticing who lied about missing packages. He nodded toward the street. "Your son came by last night." I stopped sweeping when, around 11, I looked up. Daniel had not called. Mr. Alvarez said, "He parked down by the corner, walked up to your side gate." My hand tightened on the broom. "What did he do?" "Tried the gate, then looked at your windows. When my porch light came on, he left." I thanked him. He lowered his voice. "Tom, whatever this is, don't handle it like family if they're not acting like family." That sentence stayed with me. Don't handle it like family if they're not acting like family. I wish I had listened sooner. The next month, Daniel changed tactics. He became kind. Too kind. He brought groceries. He fixed the loose railing by the back steps. He invited me to dinner. Melissa hugged me when I arrived, though her body stayed stiff as a fence post. Their house was newer than mine, bigger in some ways, but it had no soul. Everything was gray and white, glass tables, abstract art, pillows no one was allowed to lean on. Their daughter, my granddaughter, Sophie, was 17 then. She came down the stairs wearing an oversized sweatshirt, her brown hair tied up messily, and when she saw me, her face changed, not happiness, relief. She hugged me longer than usual, too long. I whispered, "You all right?" She pulled back quickly and said, "Yeah, just missed you." But her eyes flicked toward the kitchen, toward Melissa. At dinner, Daniel poured wine and talked about the future like a salesman. He said we should plan responsibly. He said houses become burdens. He said he had been reading about cognitive decline in older adults. Melissa placed a folder beside my plate. I stared at it. She smiled. "Just some information, nothing scary." Inside were brochures for retirement communities. Luxury ones, expensive ones, places where families send old people when guilt needs marble countertops. I closed the folder. Daniel said, "Dad, don't shut down." I said, "I'm not moving." Melissa's smile thinned. "No one said moving tonight." Sophie dropped her fork. The sound cracked through the room. Everyone looked at her. She stared at her plate. Daniel snapped, "Careful." That was new. Daniel had never spoken sharply to Sophie in front of me before. I watched her hands. They were trembling. After dinner, while Melissa loaded the dishwasher and Daniel took a call in the living room, Sophie followed me to the hall. She slipped something into my coat pocket, so quickly I almost didn't feel it. Then she whispered, "Don't open it here." My blood went cold. I looked at her. Her eyes were wet. "What is it?" She shook her head. "Please, Grandpa, just go home." I still remember the look on her face. Fear mixed with guilt. A child standing inside a secret too large for her body. I drove home slowly. The roads were slick and my headlights caught the rain like needles. When I got inside, I locked the door, went to my kitchen table, and pulled the folded paper from my coat pocket. It was a printed email. No subject line, just a chain between Melissa and someone named Grant. The first line made my stomach turn. "Once Tom signs the competency acknowledgement, Daniel can move forward without court delays." What? I read it 3 times. Competency acknowledgement, not retirement planning, not safety, control. The email went on. Grant said the transfer paperwork should be ready by Friday. Melissa replied, "He won't sign if he reads it. Daniel thinks he can get him emotional enough." Then came the sentence that made the room tilt. "Worst case, we use the medical route." I sat there in the quiet house with the paper in my hand. The rain had stopped. but I could still hear water dripping from the gutters. One drop, then another, like a countdown. I should have called Daniel right then. I should have driven back and demanded answers. But age teaches you one thing anger never does. If someone is setting a trap, never let them know you saw the rope. So I folded the email, put it in a plastic sleeve, and placed it in the fireproof safe in my closet. Then I did what I had done for 40 years whenever something didn't smell right. I started a file. I named it Daniel. For the next 3 weeks, I documented everything, every call, every visit, every strange piece of mail, every missing document. I installed 2 cameras, one facing the front porch, another inside the workshop. Not obvious ones. I had learned long ago that visible cameras make dishonest people perform. Hidden cameras make them reveal. Daniel came by twice. Both times he tried to bring up paperwork. Both times I played tired, confused, lonely. It was not hard to act lonely. That part was true. One afternoon, he sat across from me in the living room holding a pen. He said, "Dad, this just lets me help if something happens." I looked at the document. Power of attorney, broad authority, financial, medical, property, real estate. I let my hands shake a little as I picked it up. "You think I can't take care of myself?" His face softened. For a second, I saw the boy he used to be. Then he said, "I think Mom's gone and you're not the same." There it was, not concern. Opportunity dressed as concern. I said, "Leave it with me." He hesitated. "Melissa said the lawyer needs it today." I smiled faintly. Then Melissa should have married the lawyer. He didn't laugh. After he left, I scanned the document. Then I called an old friend. Her name was Elaine Porter. For 22 years, Elaine had been one of the best probate attorneys in the county. She had handled Eliner's estate planning. She had also once told a judge in open court that opposing counsel's argument had the structural integrity of wet cardboard. I always liked Elaine. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Thomas Whitaker, tell me you're calling for coffee and not trouble." I said, "I think my son is trying to take my house." Silence, then her voice changed. "Bring everything." The next morning, I drove to her office downtown. Her assistant looked older than I remembered, which made me wonder how old I looked to everyone else. Elaine met me in the lobby. She wore a navy suit and silver-framed glasses. No nonsense. No hugs, just one hand on my shoulder. "Tom." That almost broke me. Not because it was warm, because it was steady. When you are being quietly hunted by your own family, steadiness feels like shelter. We sat in her conference room for 2 hours. I showed her the email from Sophie, the power of attorney, the opened mail, the senior facility inquiry, the camera stills of Daniel trying my gate at night. Elaine read everything without interrupting. When she reached the email, her mouth tightened. "Who is Grant?" "I don't know. We'll find out." Then she pulled a thick folder from a locked cabinet. Eliner's trust documents. I had seen them before, years earlier, but grief and time had blurred the details. Elaine opened the folder and slid one page toward me. "Tom, before Eliner died, she made an amendment." I frowned. "What amendment?" Elaine looked at me carefully. "You knew she changed part of the trust after Daniel's bankruptcy scare." I remembered that. Daniel had nearly lost everything in a failed restaurant investment. Eliner had cried for 2 nights, afraid he would end up on the street. I had told her helping him again would only teach him the wrong lesson. We argued, one of our worst arguments. Later, she met with Elaine alone. I thought it was about protecting Daniel's inheritance from creditors. Elaine tapped the page. She did more than that. I leaned forward. My wife's signature was at the bottom. Strong then, before the shaking, before the weight loss, before the hospital bed. Elaine said, "Eliner transferred the house into the Whitaker Family Residence Trust." I nodded slowly. I remember the trust. But not the ownership structure. I looked at her. Elaine continued, "You retained lifetime occupancy, full rights to live there, control maintenance, and reject sale during your lifetime." That sounds right. The remainder interest did not go to Daniel. My throat tightened. "What?" Elaine's eyes softened. "Eliner left the property after your death to Sophie." For a moment I could not speak. The room blurred, not from confusion, from Eliner. I could almost hear her voice. "Don't let loneliness make your decisions." Elaine said she didn't tell Daniel because she was afraid of how he'd react. I sat back. My own son was trying to steal a house that his mother had already protected from him. And worse, he was stealing it from his own daughter. That was only the beginning. Elaine turned the page. "There's more." I closed my eyes briefly. I wasn't sure I wanted more. She said, "The trust names you as primary trustee. If you become incapacitated, I become temporary trustee until Sophie turns 25. I opened my eyes, not Daniel. No. I laughed once, not because it was funny, because Alina had known. My sweet, gentle Alina, who gave people second chances like other people gave directions, had known our son better than I did. Elaine said, "Tom, if Daniel has any document claiming you transferred the house to him, it's either invalid or fraudulent. You can't transfer full ownership of something you don't personally own outright." I looked down at the paper. "That notice on my door hasn't come yet." What? Elaine frowned. "What notice?" I shook my head. "I just have a feeling." She studied me. "Then we need to move before they do." But Daniel moved faster than we expected. 3 days later, a letter arrived from a finance company I had never heard of. It thanked me for my inquiry about refinancing. I had made no inquiry. The letter included a loan number. I called Elaine. She told me not to call the company myself. Her investigator did. By evening, Elaine called back. Her voice was tight. "Tom, someone submitted a loan application using your information." I sat down slowly. "How?" Attached was a copy of a deed showing you transferred the property to Daniel 6 months ago. My chest went cold. 6 months ago, Alina was dying. 6 months ago, I had barely slept. 6 months ago, people came in and out of my house every day bringing food and flowers. That was when they had taken the documents. Elaine said, "The deed was recorded." I gripped the phone. "That's impossible." "Not impossible, fraudulent." The word hung in the air. Fraudulent, not family conflict, not misunderstanding, a crime. I asked, "Who notarized it?" Elaine paused. "A woman named Paula Grant." Grant, the name from Melissa's email. My hand tightened so hard the phone creaked. "Find out if she's related to Melissa." I already did. Of course she had. Elaine Porter did not wait for obvious questions. She is Melissa's aunt. That was the moment grief became something else, not rage. Rage burns too hot and too fast. This was colder, cleaner. A line inside me went still. I had been a husband, a father, a grieving old man, but before that I had been an investigator, and now my son had walked into a structure he did not understand. The next week brought the escalation, fast, cruel, carefully timed. Daniel arrived at my house with Melissa and a man in a gray suit named Grant Caldwell, not Paula Grant, Grant Caldwell, a real estate attorney. He looked young enough to still believe expensive shoes made him powerful. I let them in because Elaine told me to. The living room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. Alina's portrait sat on the side table. Daniel avoided looking at it. Melissa did not. She looked directly at it, almost challengingly. Grant opened a folder. "Mr. Whitaker, we're hoping to resolve this amicably." I sat in my chair, the same chair where I had read to Sophie when she was small. I said, "Resolve what?" Daniel sighed dramatically. "Dad." I looked at him. He had practiced this. I could see it. His face arranged into sadness. His voice low, his wife beside him, ready to cry if needed. Grant said, "Records show the property was transferred to your son Daniel Whitaker earlier this year." I nodded slowly. "Do they?" Daniel leaned forward. "You signed it, Dad." "No, you did." Melissa touched his arm. "Daniel, don't push." Then she looked at me with wet eyes. "Tom, we know this is hard. You were under a lot of stress when Alina was sick." I stared at her. There are people who lie with their mouths. Melissa lied with her whole face. Grant continued, "Daniel is willing to allow you time to transition, but legally the property belongs to him." I said, "Legally?" He nodded. "That is correct." I asked, "And if I don't leave?" Daniel's sadness vanished for half a second. There he was, the real man underneath. "Then we'll have to take steps." I looked at my son, the boy who used to fall asleep on my chest during thunderstorms, the teenager I taught to drive in the church parking lot, the man who stood in my living room planning to throw me out of the home where his mother died. I said quietly, "What would your mother think?" His face hardened. "Mom isn't here." The words landed like a shovel hitting frozen ground. Melissa looked down. Grant shifted in his chair. Even Daniel seemed to hear how ugly it sounded. But then he recovered. "And maybe if she was, she'd tell you to stop fighting your family." I almost smiled, because that was when I knew. He had no idea what Alina had done. He had no idea the house was already beyond his reach, but I still needed the full shape of the crime, so I did not show my hand. I looked tired. I let my shoulders slump. I said, "I need time." Daniel exhaled. Melissa's hand relaxed in her lap. Grant nodded like he had won. 10 days. I said nothing. Daniel stood. As he passed my chair, he bent close and whispered, "Don't make this embarrassing." That evening, I sat in the dark until the streetlights came on. The house felt different, not empty, alert, like every wall had heard what happened and was waiting. At 9:12 p.m., Sophie called. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Grandpa." "Sophie, are you safe?" "I think so." "Where are you?" "My room." I heard a door close softly. Then she started crying. I had seen Sophie cry before, when she scraped her knee, when Alina died, when her dog had to be put down, but this was different. This was a child crying quietly because loud crying was dangerous. I said, "Tell me." She said, "They're lying." "I know." She sobbed once. "No, Grandpa, more than you know." I closed my eyes. What happened? She told me she had heard Melissa on the phone. The loan had fallen through. The finance company had questions. So Daniel and Melissa had decided to push the eviction anyway, using the recorded deed and claiming I was refusing to leave property I had gifted him. She said they were trying to get me declared incompetent if I fought. She said Melissa had been collecting examples, forgetting names, repeating stories, leaving the stove on, except I had not left the stove on. I had not forgotten names. I had repeated stories because old men do that sometimes, and because Daniel only heard me when he needed evidence. Then Sophie said something that made my heart stop. "Mom told Dad if the court believes you're confused, nobody will listen to you." I looked toward the hallway, toward the framed photos on the wall, my life, my family, my evidence apparently. Sophie whispered, "Grandpa, they want to put you somewhere." I stood up. The room seemed too small. "Did they hurt you?" "No." But she answered too quickly, "Sophie." Silence. Then she said, "Dad grabbed my arm yesterday because I said Grandma wouldn't want this." My hand curled into a fist. My son could steal from me, lie about me, humiliate me. But putting his hands on Sophie changed the weather in my blood. I said very calmly, "Listen to me. Do not argue with them. Do not confront them. Do not tell them you spoke to me. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good girl." She cried harder then. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner." "No," I said. "You are doing the bravest thing anyone in this family has done." After we hung up, I called Elaine. It was almost 10. She answered. I said, "They're going after Sophie now." Elaine said, "Then tomorrow we stop reacting." That was the reversal, the moment I stopped being the old man defending himself and became the man building a case. Elaine filed an emergency action the next morning. Quiet title, fraudulent conveyance, elder financial exploitation, temporary restraining order, petition to suspend any eviction proceedings pending review. She also filed a sealed affidavit regarding Sophie's safety concerns, but courts move like old machinery, slow, heavy, sometimes too late. Daniel knew something was happening before the order was signed. Someone at the courthouse tipped Grant Caldwell off. That afternoon, Daniel called me 11 times. I did not answer. Then Melissa called. I did not answer. Then a text came, "You're making a mistake." Then another, "Mom would be ashamed." Then Daniel's final message at 6:43 p.m., "You want war, you'll get war." I took a screenshot, added it to the file. At 8:17 p.m., headlights swept across my living room wall. A vehicle stopped outside, not Daniel's SUV. A white pickup. 2 men got out. I watched from the dark hall as they walked toward my garage. One carried bolt cutters. I did not move. I did not turn on the light. I pressed the button on my phone and watched the camera feed. They cut the lock on the workshop. My workshop. The place where Alina's cedar box still sat unfinished. They stepped inside. One of them said, "He's got some nice stuff." The other laughed. "Boss said clear anything valuable." "Boss," I called 911. Then I called Mr. Alvarez. I said, "Porch light." Across the street, his porch light snapped on, then his floodlight. Then his son's truck, parked in the driveway, flashed its headlights. The men froze. One said, "We gotta go." They ran. The police caught them 2 blocks away. Their names were Kyle and Brent. They claimed Daniel had hired them to remove items from his property. Daniel denied it. Of course he did. But Kyle had texts. A man trying to steal a house should never hire thieves who keep receipts. The next morning, Daniel came to my door. I did not open it. He pounded hard enough to rattle the glass. "Dad." I stood inside, phone recording. "Open the door." I said through the wood, "Leave." "You called the cops on me. You sent men to my workshop." "That is my workshop now." There it was, on video, clear as church bells. I said nothing. He kept going. You think your little lawyer scares me. You think some paperwork changes what you promised me. What? I had promised him nothing. But guilt has a way of inventing contracts. He yelled, "You're going to lose anyway. Your old dad. Nobody is giving that house to a confused old man over his own son." A curtain moved next door, then another. Daniel lowered his voice, but the camera caught it. "You should have signed when Melissa told you. Now I'm done being nice." I heard Alina's voice in my memory. "Don't let loneliness make your decisions." I said, "Goodbye, Daniel." He kicked the bottom of the door, then left. 3 hours later, Adult Protective Services called. Someone had reported that I was unsafe living alone. Someone claimed I was paranoid, refusing care, and possibly suffering cognitive decline. The report was anonymous. But Melissa had used phrases from the senior facility brochure. Elaine told me to cooperate fully. A woman named Mrs. Reed came to the house. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and a tired briefcase. I invited her in, made coffee, showed her my medication list, my calendar, my emergency contacts, my recent physical exam, and the neurocognitive screening Elaine had already arranged 2 days earlier. Perfect score. Mrs. Reed looked surprised, then relieved. She said, "Mr. Whitaker, you are very organized." I smiled. My wife said I labeled things because I didn't trust the universe. She laughed, then I showed her the file, not everything, just enough. When she left, her face had changed, not pity, concern for me, yes, but also for Sophie. That mattered later. The court hearing was set for December 4th. Daniel's side tried to delay. Elaine objected. The judge denied delay because an eviction notice had already been posted. That was the red notice on my door. The one Daniel came to watch. He wanted to see me receive it. He wanted neighbors to see me diminished. That morning, I had been making oatmeal when the knock came. The deputy was polite, embarrassed. He said he was just doing his job. I believed him. Daniel stood in the driveway with Melissa beside the SUV. Sophie was not there. I looked at the notice. That was when I saw the crack. The notice listed the plaintiff as Daniel Whitaker, but the property description used the old parcel number, the number from before the county replat 17 years ago. A number no valid trust document had used since 2006. A number copied from an old folder, the red folder Melissa had taken from my file cabinet. That tiny mistake told me exactly where the fake deed came from. Not county records, not Elaine's office, my grief, my trust. Daniel laughed, but I was already building the wall that would crush him. Courtrooms are strange places. They feel both ordinary and terrifying. Wood benches, fluorescent lights. A seal on the wall, people whispering as if whispers can hide the truth. I wore my navy suit, the one Alina liked. Elaine sat beside me, calm as stone. Daniel sat across the aisle with Melissa and Grant Caldwell. Daniel did not look at me. Melissa did. She looked confident, not happy. Confident. People like Melissa believe confidence can substitute for evidence. Sometimes, for a while, it does. The judge was a woman named Honorable Patricia Hensley, late 60s, sharp eyes, a voice that made everyone sit straighter. She looked over the file and said, "We are here on emergency motions regarding possession and title of 144 Willow Ridge Lane." My house reduced to an address. Grant Caldwell stood first. He spoke smoothly. He said I had transferred the property voluntarily. He said Daniel was only trying to manage a difficult family situation. He said I had become confused after my wife's death. He said Daniel had allowed me to remain temporarily out of compassion. Compassion. I looked at Daniel. He stared at the table. Grant continued, "Unfortunately, Mr. Whitaker has become hostile and paranoid, forcing his son to pursue lawful possession." Elaine wrote something on her legal pad. I glanced down. She had written one word. Good. I almost smiled. Because the more they called me confused, the more they opened the door to proving I was. Grant submitted the deed. The judge reviewed it. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Whitaker, do you understand the nature of today's proceeding?" I stood, "Yes, Your Honor." "What is your understanding?" I said, "My son claims I transferred ownership of my home to him while my wife was dying. He is using that claim to remove me from the property. I believe the deed is fraudulent and legally impossible under the trust structure governing the residence." The courtroom went quiet. The judge looked back down. Then at Grant, "Counsel." Grant cleared his throat. "Your Honor, grief can sometimes create confusion that sounds." Judge Hensley raised one hand. "Do not finish that sentence unless you intend to support it with medical evidence." Grant stopped. Elaine stood. "Your Honor, we have medical evidence." She handed documents to the clerk. Recent cognitive screening, primary physician letter, full capacity assessment. Mr. Whitaker is competent. The judge read. Daniel shifted in his seat. Melissa whispered something. Elaine continued, more importantly, Your Honor, opposing counsel's deed purports to transfer an interest Mr. Whitaker did not possess in the manner represented. The judge looked up. Explain. Elaine turned to me for half a second, then back to the judge. The residence at 144 Willow Ridge Lane is owned by the Whitaker Family Residence Trust, established by Alina Whitaker. Mr. Thomas Whitaker holds lifetime occupancy and serves as primary trustee. The remainder beneficiary is not Daniel Whitaker. Daniel's head snapped up. Melissa went still. Grant frowned. Elaine said the remainder beneficiary is Daniel's daughter, Sophie Whitaker. A sound moved through the courtroom, not loud, a breath, a shift, the kind of sound people make when the truth steps into the room wearing muddy boots. Daniel turned to Melissa. Melissa's face had gone pale. That was the first satisfying moment, not because he was hurt, because for the first time he was surprised. Elaine handed the trust documents forward. Judge Hensley read carefully. The silence stretched, then she looked at Grant Caldwell. Was your client aware of this trust? Grant swallowed. I was not provided these documents, Your Honor. The judge's eyes moved to Daniel. Mr. Whitaker. Daniel stood too quickly. I didn't know about any trust. Elaine said, that may be true, Your Honor, but ignorance does not validate a fraudulent deed. Grant objected. The judge allowed Elaine to continue. Elaine then showed the old parcel number, the deed description, the mismatch, the notarization date, my hospital visitor logs, because on the date I supposedly signed the deed at home, I was not home. I was at St. Mary's Medical Center with Alina. Security footage placed me there from 8:12 a.m. until 9:47 p.m. The deed said I signed at 2:15 p.m. In my living room, the notary, Paula Grant, had sworn she verified my identity in person. She had not. Then came the signature. Elaine placed my real signature beside the deed signature. Even from the gallery, anyone could see it. Mine leaned slightly right. The forged one leaned left. Mine connected the T and W in Whitaker. The forged one did not. I had signed thousands of reports in my career. My signature was muscle memory. The fake looked like someone had copied it from a Christmas card. Then Elaine played the video. Daniel at my door. That is my workshop now. Your old dad. Nobody is giving that house to a confused old man over his own son. My son's voice filled the courtroom. Flat, ugly, undeniable. Daniel stared at the table. Melissa stared at the exit. Then Elaine introduced the text from Daniel to the two men who broke into my workshop. Grant objected again. Judge Hensley allowed it for the limited purpose of motive and conduct. Daniel whispered, "This is insane." The judge heard him. Mr. Whitaker, you will remain silent unless addressed. He did for once. Then came the final turn. Elaine called Sophie. I did not know she was there. She entered from the hallway with Mrs. Reed from Adult Protective Services beside her. My granddaughter looked small in that room, 17 years old. Brown hair pulled back, face pale, but her eyes found mine. I nodded once. You are safe. She took the stand. Daniel leaned toward Grant, furious. Melissa whispered, no. Sophie told the truth, not dramatically, not perfectly. Truth rarely sounds polished. She said she had heard her parents discussing the house. She said Melissa told Daniel that if I looked unstable, the court would move faster. She said they planned to use a medical evaluation to control my finances. She said Daniel had grabbed her arm when she objected. She said she had given me the email because she was scared. Elaine showed the email. Grant Caldwell looked like a man watching his career step onto thin ice. Judge Hensley read it. Her face did not change, but the room did. You could feel it. Some truths carry weight. This one did. Then the judge asked Sophie one question. Did your grandfather ever tell you to lie or exaggerate anything today? Sophie looked directly at her. No, Your Honor, Grandpa told me not to fight with them. He told me to stay safe. I looked down because that almost broke me, not the betrayal, not the fake deed, not the eviction notice, but that child sitting in court having to be braver than her father. When Sophie stepped down, Daniel finally looked at me. His face was no longer smug, it was wounded, angry, betrayed somehow, as if I had done this to him. That is something you learn about manipulative people. When their trap fails, they feel attacked by your escape. Judge Hensley took a recess, 20 minutes. The longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the hallway on a wooden bench. Sophie came to me. For a second, she stood there like she wasn't sure she was allowed. Then I opened my arms. She folded into me and cried into my suit jacket. I'm sorry, she whispered. I held her tighter. No more apologies. She said, Dad hates me now. I looked over her head at the courtroom doors. No, your father hates mirrors. She pulled back. What? I wiped a tear from her cheek. You became one. When court resumed, Judge Hensley's ruling was calm and devastating. She suspended the eviction immediately. She found substantial evidence that the deed was fraudulent. She ordered the disputed deed removed from the chain of title pending final adjudication. She prohibited Daniel and Melissa from entering the property. She referred the matter to the district attorney for investigation into elder financial exploitation, forgery, and fraudulent notarization. She ordered that Sophie remain temporarily with me if she wished, pending family court review. Then she looked directly at Daniel. Mr. Whittaker, this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented today. You sought to dispossess your father from a home you did not legally own, based on a document that appears to have been executed under false circumstances. You also appear to have attempted to weaponize allegations of incapacity without medical basis. Daniel stood frozen. The judge continued, The house was never yours. Those 5 words did what I could not. They stripped him bare. The house was never yours, not when he smiled in my driveway, not when he sent men to my workshop, not when he called me confused, not when he laughed. Then the judge said the words that changed everything. The residence belongs to the Whittaker Family Residence Trust, with Thomas Whittaker retaining lifetime rights and Sophie Whittaker named as remainder beneficiary. Sophie covered her mouth. Daniel turned slowly toward her. His own daughter, the real future owner of the house he had tried to steal. The courtroom went silent. For the first time in my life, I saw my son understand that greed had not just cost him my trust, it had exposed him to his child. And there are some losses no appeal can fix. Outside the courthouse, reporters were not waiting. This was not a movie. There was no crowd, no dramatic music. Just cold air, gray sky, and the sound of traffic. Daniel came toward me near the steps. Elaine moved between us, but I raised a hand. He stopped 3 feet away. His eyes were red. Whether from shame or anger, I couldn't tell. He said, Dad. One word, small, almost human. I waited. He looked at Sophie standing beside me, then back at me. You turned her against me. That was what he chose, not apology, not regret. Accusation. Sophie flinched. I said, No, Daniel, you made her watch. His face twisted. You don't understand what it's like. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny left. What is like? To always be second to a dead woman's memory, to always be judged. There it was, the old wound, the excuse beneath all the theft. I said, Your mother loved you. He snapped, She gave my house to my daughter. No, I said, She protected Sophie from the man you became. He looked like I had struck him. Maybe I had, with truth. Melissa came up behind him, gripping his arm. We're leaving, she said, but Daniel kept staring at me. His voice dropped. You'll regret this. Elaine stepped forward. Mr. Whittaker, I strongly recommend you stop speaking. For once he listened. They left. Sophie and I stood on the courthouse steps until their SUV disappeared. Then she whispered, Can I really stay with you? I looked at her. The child Eleanor had chosen. The child Daniel had almost robbed. I said, The house has been waiting for you. That evening we went home. Home, not property, not asset. Home. The red notice was still on the door. Sophie stood beside me as I pulled it down. The tape tore slowly. I folded the paper once. Then again, she said, Why are you keeping it? I looked at the notice. Some things remind you what people are capable of. She nodded. Then after a moment she said, And what you survived. I smiled. Eleanor would have loved that. Inside, the house smelled like dust and lemon oil and old wood. Sophie walked through the rooms quietly, touching things like she was afraid they might disappear. In the hallway, she stopped at Eleanor's photograph. Grandma knew, didn't she? I stood behind her. Yes. She knew Dad might do something like this. I wanted to defend him. Some old reflex in me still wanted to soften the truth, but Sophie deserved better than comfort built on lies. I said, She knew he could be weak when money was involved. Sophie looked at the photo. She still loved him. Yes. How? I thought about that for a long time. Then I said, Love and trust are not the same thing. That became one of the lessons of the house. Over the next months, the case widened. Paula Grant, the notary, admitted she had not witnessed my signature. She claimed Melissa pressured her. Melissa claimed Daniel handled the documents. Daniel claimed Grant Caldwell advised him everything was fine. Grant Caldwell claimed he relied on client representations. That's how guilty people dance. Everyone pointing to everyone else while standing in the same fire. The district attorney charged Daniel and Melissa with multiple counts. Forgery, fraudulent recording, attempted elder exploitation, conspiracy. Paula took a plea. Grant Caldwell lost his license pending review. Daniel avoided prison at first because the case dragged on, but he lost almost everything else. His job, his marriage, his daughter, his reputation. Melissa filed for divorce 6 months after the hearing, which surprised no one except Daniel. She had never loved him, she loved access. And once Daniel became a liability, she left him the way she found him, empty-handed and blaming someone else. One afternoon the following spring, Daniel came to the house again, not to the door. The restraining order prevented that. He stood across the street near the mailbox. Thin, unshaven, older than he had looked months before. I saw him from the porch. Sophie was inside studying for finals. Daniel raised one hand, not a wave, a request. I walked down to the sidewalk but stopped on my side of the street. He said, "I just want to talk." I said, "Talk." He looked at the house. His eyes moved to the maple tree, the one planted when he was born. For a moment I wondered if memory might save him. Then he said, "I didn't know Mom changed the trust." I stared at him. That was still his wound, not what he did, what he failed to get. I said, "That is what you came to say." He swallowed. I was desperate. "No," I said, "you were entitled." His jaw tightened. "You always thought the worst of me. I spent years thinking better of you than you deserved." That landed. He looked away. Cars passed. A dog barked somewhere, life continuing around a broken thing. Daniel said, "I'm still your son." I felt that sentence in my chest, because it was true. That is the cruel part. Betrayal does not erase love. It poisons it. It makes love unsafe to hold. I said, "Yes, you are." He looked back, hopeful. I continued, "But you are not welcome in my home." His face collapsed into anger. "So that's it." "No," I said, "that is the consequence." He laughed once, bitter. "You sound like a judge." I shook my head. "No, I sound like a father who finally stopped confusing mercy with permission." He stood there for a long moment. Then he looked toward the upstairs window. "Sophie in there?" "Yes." "Can I see her?" "No." His eyes hardened. "You don't get to decide that forever." I said, "You're right. One day she will. And when that day comes, the kind of man you become now will matter." For the first time, he had no answer. He walked away, not defeated. Not redeemed, just smaller. Some people expect every story to end with forgiveness. A hug, a tearful apology, a family dinner where everyone learns, but real life is not that tidy. Some people do not become better because they are exposed. They only become quieter. Daniel did eventually plead guilty to reduced charges. He received probation, restitution obligations, and a permanent stain on his record. The court ordered him to pay legal fees tied to clearing the title. He never paid all of it. Men like Daniel always leave someone else holding a bill, but the house stayed safe. Sophie stayed with me until college. She took Alina's old room first, then moved into the upstairs room facing the maple tree. Sometimes I heard her crying at night. Not every night, but enough. I never forced her to talk. I just made tea and left it outside her door. Some mornings the cup was empty, some mornings untouched. Healing is not a straight road. It is a porch light left on, a chair kept open, a person waiting without demanding. That summer, Sophie and I repaired the workshop door, the one Daniel's men had damaged. I taught her how to sand wood properly, with the grain, not against it. She said, "That sounds like advice." I said, "Most woodworking is advice." She laughed, a real laugh, the first one in months. We finished Alina's cedar box together. Inside, I placed the red eviction notice, the fake deed, a copy of the court order, and one photograph of Alina standing beneath the maple tree holding baby Daniel. Sophie asked why I included that photo. I said, because people are more than the worst thing they do, but the worst thing they do still matters. She ran her fingers over the edge of the box. "Do you hate him?" I looked out the workshop window. The maple leaves moved softly in the summer wind. "No." "Why not?" "Because hate would make him the owner of too much inside me." She nodded slowly. "Do you forgive him?" I answered honestly, "Not yet." Maybe that disappoints you. Maybe you expected an old man to reach the end of his story with a clean heart and wise smile. But I promised the truth. And the truth is, some wounds do not close just because justice arrives. The court can restore a title. It cannot restore a son. It cannot give back the version of Daniel who once slept through thunderstorms on my chest. It cannot give a leaner another chance to see what he became. It cannot erase the sound of his laugh in my driveway. But justice can do one thing. It can draw a line. And sometimes a line is the beginning of peace. 2 years later, Sophie graduated, not high school, college. She studied social work. No surprise there. Children who survive manipulation often develop a powerful instinct for protecting others. At her graduation, she wore a leaner's pearl earrings. After the ceremony, she hugged me and whispered, "Grandma would have cried." I said, "She is." Sophie smiled through tears. Then she told me she wanted to work with elder abuse victims. I looked at her standing there in the sunlight, strong and gentle at the same time, and I thought of a leaner's trust, not the legal one. The deeper one. She had trusted the future to Sophie. She had been right. Years passed. The house changed. I changed. The porch boards needed replacing. My hands grew stiffer. The stairs became less friendly. But I stayed, not because I was stubborn, because that house held witnesses. The kitchen had heard a leaner sing. The hallway had watched Sophie grow brave. The workshop had survived thieves. The front door had held against my son's fist. And the maple tree, older now, still dropped leaves every November like small golden letters from the past. Sometimes neighbors would ask about Daniel, not directly. People rarely ask directly about family shame. They say things like, "Have you heard from your son?" Or, "Is Daniel still living nearby?" I would say, "He's alive." That was enough. The last time I saw him was at Mr. Alvarez's funeral. Daniel stood at the back of the church, older, gray at the temples. He did not approach me during the service. Afterward, as people gathered outside, he came near. Sophie was beside me. She was 26 then, a grown woman, the real owner of the house now in every way that mattered, though my life rights remained. Daniel looked at her first. "Sophie." She nodded, "Dad." That word came out carefully, not warm, not cruel, careful. He looked at me. "I heard you had some trouble with your knee." I almost smiled. Old family habits are strange. After everything, he had opened with health. "I'm managing." He nodded, silence. Then he said, "I've been going to meetings." I did not ask what kind. Maybe debt, maybe anger. Maybe men who finally ran out of people to blame. He said, "I know I can't fix it." No one spoke. He looked at Sophie. "I know what I did." Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. "Do you?" He swallowed. "I know I chose money over you." That was the first true sentence I had heard from him in years. Not complete, not enough, but true. Sophie wiped one tear. Daniel turned to me. "And over you." I looked at my son. There was no courtroom, no judge, no lawyer, no evidence folder. Just an old church parking lot and 3 people standing inside the long shadow of one man's greed. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I had imagined those words many times. Sometimes I thought they would heal me. Sometimes I thought I would reject them. But when they came, they were smaller than I expected. Not because they meant nothing, because time had already done its work. I said, "I hope you become the kind of man who understands what that apology costs." He nodded, "I'm trying." Sophie said, "Keep trying." He looked at her like that hurt and helped at the same time. Then he walked away. There was no hug, no reunion, no music, just a man leaving with less arrogance than he arrived with. And maybe for him that was a beginning. That night, Sophie and I sat on the porch. The air smelled like cut grass and rain. She said, "Do you believe him?" I watched the maple branches moving against the dark sky. "I believe he wants to believe himself." She smiled sadly. "That's very grandpa." I laughed, then she leaned her head on my shoulder. We sat there quietly. After a while, she said, "I used to think the house was the thing everyone fought over." I nodded, "And now?" She looked at the lit windows. The house was just where the truth finally had walls. I closed my eyes, because that sounded like a leaner too. These days, I keep a copy of the court order in the same cedar box, not because I need to look at it, because Sophie works with families now. Sometimes she brings me stories, old women whose sons drain their accounts, widowers pressured into signing papers, grandparents called confused by people who benefit from their silence. And sometimes I open the box and show her the notice, the red one. The one that said I had 72 hours to leave my home. I tell her, "This is what fear looked like." Then I show her the court order. And this is what records did. Because that is the lesson I want anyone listening to remember. Love your family, help them if you can, forgive them if your heart allows, but do not confuse blood with honesty, do not confuse tears with truth, and never let someone shame you into signing away your safety. My son laughed when I lost my house. He laughed because he thought age had made me weak. He laughed because he thought grief had made me careless. He laughed because he thought a father's love would keep me quiet. But the court revealed what Alina had known all along. The house was never his. The future was never his. And the old man he tried to bury still knew how to read the foundation. Sometimes I stand under the maple tree at sunset and touch the bark with my palm. I think of Alina planting it with dirt on her dress and hope in her hands. I think of Daniel as a baby beneath its shade. I think of Sophie, who will one day own not just the house but the truth that saved it. And I have finally made peace with one thing. A home is not protected by locks alone. It is protected by memory, by documents, by courage, by the people who refuse to let lies move in and call themselves family. So if you ever find yourself standing on your own porch with a notice on your door and someone you love smiling at your pain, do not break, do not beg, look closely. There is always a crack in the lie, and sometimes that tiny crack is where justice enters.